What is going on, guys? As often comes up in the chat, a really good idea, I think, for an episode. How short is too short? When does it become less obvious? A rifle round versus a pistol round. What are the attributes? What are you giving up, gaining in one versus the other in really short barrels? S.B.R.s, the unconventional type pistols, P.D.W.s. That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. I'm not going to talk a lot about the bio today. It's in the show notes. If you haven't seen it before, you should care who you're listening to and why. So check out the bio in the show notes. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. With that, let us get into really short barrels. I don't want to mansplain or tactisplain to you guys, but not everybody popped out of their mama knowing everything about ballistics. Nobody popped out of their mom's womb with a ballistics calculator or a ballistics chart. So forgive me if I'm oversimplifying here or if I'm going way back to the beginning. However, let's start out with rifles are almost always far, far more effective than handguns. And this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers. But when people are like, what handgun should I get for home defense? My answer is none handguns. You should get a long gun. A long gun is better than a handgun, unless you go to the ridiculous, right? If you're talking about like any standard handgun, I don't care if it's 9mm, 45, 40 Smith & Wesson, even 10mm, right? I don't care. All of that is weak and puny compared to just about any centerfire rifle caliber or any 20 gauge, 12 gauge shotgun. It's ridiculous to compare the two. So that said, rifles are far more powerful than handguns. Go look up at a study by Greg Ellifrit's alternate look at a handgun stopping power. And he just compares a bunch of different handgun calibers, but then he throws in like rifles and shotguns. It's not even close. The effectiveness is not even close, right? And if you need any more justification, nobody sends their troops into battle with only handguns, right? If a troop has a handgun, and I had a handgun sometimes during the war, it's because I had another primary weapon system. I was in charge of demolitions. I was in charge of a rocket launcher, small shoulder-fired multi-purpose assault weapon. I got stuck on the radio, right? Something. And I had a handgun. Nobody sends their frontline infantry troops in mass with handguns. You know why? Because they're not even close to as effective as a rifle. Rifles are more effective. Now, to make it simple, for most practical rifle barrel lengths and most practical rifle cartridges, the shorter you go, the more velocity you lose. And you have to balance that, right? You could get really high velocities if you had like a 36-inch barrel. But who wants to carry around a 36-inch barrel? Lighter, handier rifles, even though maybe ballistically you give up a little bit, they gain a lot as far as handiness and maneuverability and firepower versus mobility. And there is like a curve there. It's not linear. You might, for a rough estimate, you might say, well, you lose 40 feet a second for every inch of barrel you cut off. And that's maybe less true if you get really long and you start cutting off. And if you start getting shorter, you might lose a lot more than that. So we're kind of on this quest in the rifleman world, in the infantry world, in the police world, the military world, to find that good balance. And we've seen this throughout history. We see a lot of the old, look at a 9130. Look at that rifle. That thing is a tactical telephone pole. It is crazy long, crazy heavy. I'm not just picking on the Mosin. It's just a good example of that. A lot of the guns of that era were really long. The Mauser, M44 carbine? That's called a carbine because it's shorter than the Mosin a Gantt 9130. But that thing by today's standards is pretty big and heavy. And there's no real definition of a carbine versus a rifle. A carbine is just kind of a shorter, handier version of the rifle. If you look at the M16, we consider that a rifle. It's got a 20-inch barrel. We consider the M4 carbine a carbine because it has a 16-inch barrel. Now, the M16 has better ballistics than the M4. Period. It does. You shoot the same load out of that. I don't care if it's M193 or M855 or Mark 262. They're all going to give you better ballistics out of the M16 than you're going to get out of the M4. Period. End of sentence. However, the M4 is more maneuverable. The M4, I was a Marine and I was in the Army, and a lot of things I like that the Marines do better. But the Army kind of figured out that the 16-inch standard in the M4 is a good balance of maneuverability versus firepower. And if you're wondering, should I get this, should I get that, should I get shorter, should I get longer? If you don't have one, really just get a good 16-inch M4 some kind of copy of that. And if you want to go 14.5 pinned, right? I'm not going to throw a tantrum like a 6-year-old spoiled kid in a grocery store. It's fine, but there is a time and a place for a 20-inch. There's a time and a place for shorter than that. But a good balance is a 16-inch. When you start going shorter than that, you really start losing velocity fast. And there's other calibers, right? But if we're talking about let's stick with the 5.56. It's kind of the standard. When you start going more shorter than that, you start shedding velocity like water off a duck's back. It just goes down really fast. Now, the emphasis of today's show is going to be shorter than that. And shorter than that can be handy. I worked as the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. And when I did that, sometimes I would be doing, really crowded arenas, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in a small area. I would be guarding VIPs. I would be doing all kinds of stuff to where active shooters might be in really close, confined environments. Although I'm giving up some ballistics on an AR pistol, a very short-barreled AR, we're talking 10, 11 inches, the upgrade in maneuverability is really nice. I wouldn't want it as my only go-to on many of the missions. As the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters, I would take a 16-inch, just a regular, I wouldn't say regular, but a more par for the course 16-inch barreled AR. Now, sometimes I would take a 308, but that's beside the point. Today we're going to focus on the short barrels. We get even shorter than that. You can get some really, really short, handy type guns. You're talking, 5, 6, 7 inches in that range. You're getting really, really maneuverable, but is it worth it when you're talking that type of range? Remember, I said the rifle is way, way more powerful than a handgun, but that's because they have a lot more velocity, and other things. You start shedding that velocity, at what point are you just scratching your head thinking, what am I doing here? It's now, a rifle cartridge in name only, but it doesn't really perform like a rifle cartridge. It may perform more like a pistol cartridge that sounds like a flashbang. So let's look at some of those numbers today. A sight that you may be familiar with if you've been in the tactical world a long time, but if you're kind of new to this, you may not have ever heard of it. It's an older, you look at the website, it looks like something from, early days of the internet, which is cool. But it's ballistics by the inch, to give credit where credit is due. Ballistics by the inch. So let's go there and check out some of these numbers. I like to give credit where it's due. So let's look at the 223 here. We look at the 223, and we get, out of an 18-inch barrel, it lists a 55 grain, and I'm going to stick with a 55 grain for this because it's real common. You do your own research and your own numbers, but it lists a 55 grain out of an 18-inch barrel at 2983, just shy of 3,000 feet a second. And 18 is a good split between 16 and 20, right? If you look at the that listed a velocity of 29.83. If we go down to 16 inches, it only drops down to 29.43. So you're not losing a whole lot there in those 2 inches. If we jump down to 10 inches, at 10 inches, we're looking at 26.16. Pretty significant drop. If we go to just 8 inches, just 2 inches less, 23.80. Okay, so how short is too short? Let's just go to the ridiculous here. Let's say 3 inches. I am not advising that you ever use for anything serious a 3-inch 223. But if you were to drop down to a 3-inch 223 to illustrate a point, your velocity would be 1147 with a 55 grain bullet. Let that sink in. A 55 grain bullet at 1147. Now, rough numbers, right? If you look at something like just plain vanilla 9mm load, this is just a number out of my head, it's a rough number, you will be looking at pretty standard 124 grain 9mm at 1200 feet a second. So if you looked at that, you almost would be better ballistically with a standard handgun with 124 grain than you would be with this 223. Remember, I said a rifle is far more powerful than a handgun. Well, if you go to the ridiculous to a 3-inch, if you go to a 3-inch barrel, then it's not, right? Then it's not, because you don't have the room in the barrel to burn all that powder. That cartridge was designed to work in a rifle. And a rifle has a longer barrel to burn a lot of that powder. Again, I don't want to over-explain, but rifles and pistols generally use far different powders. Pistol powder burns a lot faster. It uses, pistol and shotgun use a lot of the same powder, but that powder burns a lot more quickly than a rifle, because a rifle generally has a long barrel with a tight fit, and you have more time to generate more pressure. So that slower burning powder, when given enough time and distance, will generate far greater velocities than you're going to get out of your handgun. But if you don't give it that time and that distance, it will not generate those greater velocities. So let's go back again to that, anemic 3-inch barrel. You're looking at 1147. Now, you're probably not even going to find a 3-inch barrel in any kind of P.D.W. small handy AR, but you might. I've seen some like 6-inchers. You talk about a 6-inch 55 grain, you're talking 1861. Or, I'm sorry, that's out of a 5-inch. 5-inch, 1861. 6-inch, 2041. Now, that's a lot faster than most handguns. I said most. You could, if you go to the extreme, but I'm talking common defensive handgun calibers. That's far faster. But remember, you're talking a 55 grain bullet, not a 115, not a 124, not a 147, or 230 grain if we're talking about 45 ACP. Even just at 6 inches, you're talking 2,041 feet a second, but it's a far lighter bullet. You're talking a 55 grain. Now, here's where I think the line is pretty clear. I think the line is right around 11.5 inches. There's like no debate to me in my head. If we're talking 11.5 inches, you're better off with a rifle round like a 223 than you are any handgun round. If we look at, let's say 11.5, well, it doesn't give 11.5, it gives 12. At 12 inches, you're getting 27.24. That's quite a bit. Now, it's not 2,900 out of an 18-inch barrel, but you've gotten a lot shorter barrel. You're going from 18 inches to 12 inches, right? And you haven't dropped a ton of velocity. So you're talking about 12-inch, 11.5-inch. It's not even really a debate there for me. You're better off with the rifle. But so far, we've looked at traditional handgun. We've talked about traditional handguns and traditional handgun barrel lengths. You will also, up to a point, but in the barrel lengths we're talking about, in something like a 9mm, you're going to pick up velocity if you go with longer barrels. Not as much as with a rifle, but some. if we look at, let's look at, we still 124 grain. It's not even my favorite, but listen here, 124 grain Hydroshock. Old school, but pretty standard. If we look at what I would consider a man gun, a 5-inch barrel, that 124 is at 11.15 out of a 5-inch barrel. So there we go. If we look at jumping up to an 8-inch barrel, it only jumps up to 11.80. Is that a lot more, 11.15 to 11.80? It's a little bit more. It's not a lot more. If we go all the way up to a 12-inch barrel, you're talking 12.25. So you're gaining a little over 100 feet a second. Not thousands of feet a second, like you might, not 1,000 feet a second. You're gaining 100 feet a second. The difference there is marginal. Now, you still get some other benefits. You'll get, more efficiency, more of the powder burned. You might get less flash, less noise. But really, you're not picking up a ton. If you go all the way out to an 8-inch barrel, or I'm sorry, an 18-inch barrel with that load, you're only jumping up to 12.31. Right, so even an 18-inch barrel, which you probably wouldn't do with a 9mm unless you had some weird reason to, but you're only going from the 5-inch, 11.15, to the 18-inch, you're only picking up a little over 100 feet a second. So it doesn't make a lot of sense there. Now, I don't know why in a weapon like this, not a handgun, but in a weapon like this, you'd go smaller than 5 inches. But I'll give you some rough numbers here for the 147 grain, because it is one of my favorite grain weights. 147 grain in the 5 inches, just over 1,000. So 1,007. So we get some idea here of this. If you start talking about, 8-inch barrel, you got, 1180 to 1047, depending on your load in a 9mm. But if we jump back to the 223, it's not even close as far as velocities go. You're talking for that 8-inch 2380, for a 10-inch 2616. So you're getting a lot more velocity, but you're getting a smaller bullet. So it really depends on what you want. Now, here is what I will say. This going off the reservation on either end might hurt you, because there's a lot more to ballistics than just numbers on a page. A lot of those rifle rounds were designed to perform with high velocities, especially a 223. Right? They're not really designed to perform well at those crazy low velocities. Like, I don't know what a M193 would do at a little, 1,100 and some feet a second, but not a lot. Not like it will do at 3,000 feet a second like it was designed for. So you really need to do your due diligence. I would look for a far better round if you were going to go this route in the rifle. One, and they do make short-barreled loads, one that will expand at the distances that you intend to engage a target. Now, the bullet will still kill, right? I wouldn't turn my nose up at having, a 55 grain full metal jacket hitting a target consistently at 1,100 and some feet a second. It's far better than nothing. But it wasn't what it was designed for. Likewise with the handgun. A lot of those handgun rounds are designed out of a 5-inch barrel. You're going to get more velocity if you go to the 8-inch barrel. And remember how I said to start with, handguns are not rifles. They're not as effective as a rifle. We've come a long way in making those hollow points effective. A lot more effective than they were 10 or 15 years ago. That's because we've struck a pretty good balance of penetration versus expansion. And they're inversely related, right? Every time you increase the diameter of that bullet, you decrease its ability to penetrate. That's how physics works. You might think, I'm getting more velocity, that's great. But if you get so much velocity that your hollow points are not penetrating far enough, that's not good, right? You have to penetrate deep enough to hit vital organs. Especially you're talking about going through thick jackets, you're talking about going through bone. If somebody's turning sideways, you got to get through their arm first before you reach something vital. That person's trying to kill somebody, right? These things make a difference. So you might not do better to get more velocity out of a pistol round. Now, if you really did your due diligence, then you might find one that performs well at those higher velocities. But I think a lot of the appeal of these type of weapons is I'm going to use the same magazines and the same rounds as my pistol. And I would caution that. I would caution you on that. I would rather, this is a personal decision, but I would rather have the right ammo for the right thing than worrying about whether I can swap one with another. You've got to survive with the rounds that are in your gun. Otherwise, you're just going to be a guy that is a loot drop that dies with a bunch of ammo. So choosing the right tool for the job to me is better than having, two multi-tools that are not really good for anything that I need them for, but I have redundancy. I like redundancy if I'm not giving anything up. But if you're giving up a lot of ballistic performance, to me, it's not worth it. To you, it may be. But a lot of the people, I think they're like, I'm going to go with, 9mm or 45 because I can use the same mags, I can use the same ammo. But is that really the best way to go? Because the ammo that's designed to be optimal in your handgun may not be good out of one of these longer barreled systems. So is it really worth it? You have to decide that for yourself. It's a deep topic. And if you're planning on actually using one of these on the street or in a real world environment, and a private security contracting, law enforcement, you really should do your due diligence. As a truck, gun, right, any of those. As a, well-armed citizen, do your due diligence on that. Now, there is another. The P.D.W. round, right? Look at some of the velocities of the 5.7. Now, the 5.7 was designed for this. I'm not saying it's better. I don't even own a 5.7. But it was kind of designed with this in mind. It is even lighter than the 55 grain generally. You could probably find some heavier, but it was generally designed for like 30-something, 40-something grain bullets, the 5.7. And there are some other P.D.W. rounds like the 4.6, but they're pretty obscure. Even the 5.7 is really obscure compared to 223 or 9mm, which presents its own problems. But if you're talking about this realm, you may look at it. If it makes sense at all, it makes sense in this realm, is what I'm going to say, because it was designed for this. So, if you ask me, I'm going to say the easy answer is if you're going 11 and a half inches or greater, really go with a rifle round for this kind of weapon. If you're going with a short, handy, small weapon, go with a rifle round if you're going 11.5 or longer. If you want to go shorter than 11.5 for like one of these much smaller P.D.W.s, then it's a real debate. You start talking about, I want to go 8 inches, I want to do this, I want to do that. Then it's a real debate on what you want to do, right? If it doesn't need to fit in a laptop, does it need to do this, do that? You might look for some other more creative solutions. You might think, maybe I can get a longer barrel if the weapon itself folds or takes apart. But if you needed to deploy at the ready, you need even smaller than an 11.5 AR. Then I think there's a real case for the PCC. And I'm not the biggest fan of PCCs because, in general, my opinion is, if I'm going to carry something that big, why wouldn't I carry a proper rifle round? That's just me. But if you're not going to carry something that big, then even if you might not call it a PCC, you may call it a P.D.W. But then it starts to make sense if you're going to be running 5-6 inch barrel with a shoulder stock, whatever you want to call that. You want to go the proper papered route and get an actual S.B.R., or you want to go with a pistol brace or something with a sling that you push out. Not my favorite, but you get what I'm saying. Then it starts to make a little bit more sense to have it in a pistol round. So it is an actual debate to me once you get below 11.5. Anything more than 11.5 or greater, it's like not even, I don't even debate it. It just, to me, it just makes way more sense to have a proper rifle round in that size weapon. Even though you're losing some velocity compared to a traditional carbine, you're still dealing with a lot longer point-blank range. You're still dealing with, in my opinion, much better ballistics. That's more of a primary gun to me, whereas the pistol option is more of just like a little bit better than a handgun. And it is better than a handgun, but it's not a rifle. It's not even a carbine. So just some thoughts there. You don't have to agree. Make up your own mind. If you're going to do this, a lot of that ammo, again, was designed for full-sized handguns, which is one of the reasons I urge you to carry a full-size handgun day to day. A lot of that really good hollow point ammunition was designed for law enforcement who carries a full-size handgun. So I would encourage you to be a man and carry a full-size handgun, because this PD or this person carries that round out of their 4.5 or 5-inch barreled gun. It may not perform well at all out of your little, hashtag me too 2.5-inch barrel gun. Do your own research on that. But do your own research anytime you go off the reservation. Like, a lot of the rifle rounds were designed for 16 to 20-inch barreled guns. A lot of the pistol rounds were designed for a full-size fighting handgun. If you go smaller than 4 or 5 inches or larger than 4 or 5 inches, you had better do your due diligence. And if you're not going to do that, I would encourage you to just stay with the plain vanilla, what's already proven, if you're not really going to put some time and effort into ballistics. With that, guys, I think I've drugged that out enough on really short-barreled options for fighting weapons. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate you listening. Your tactical verse of the day. A classic. I'm sure I've said it many times before, but from the mouth of Jesus. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.